The room smelled like money and lies. Ezra Okafor didn't belong there. He knew it. They knew it. And not a single person in that room let him forget it. He was pushing a mop bucket past a $12,000 conference table when the lead translator, a sharp-jawed man in a gray suit, turned around and looked at him the way people look at furniture. Not with dislike. With nothing. Just a flat, empty stare that said, "You are not relevant to what is happening here." Ezra kept his head down. Kept moving. The mop left wet streaks across marble that cost more per square foot than his monthly rent. He was staff. Janitorial staff to be exact. Blue uniform. Rubber-soled shoes. A laminated badge clipped to his chest that said Facility Crew. Level 2. He had 3 more floors to clean after this one. He was not supposed to be listening. He was not supposed to understand a single word being spoken in that room. Hi viewers. Have you ever been in a room where people treated you like you were invisible, but the whole time you were actually the most important person there? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know. That was Ezra Okafor, 34 years old, former language instructor for displaced PAC settlements in 6 different states. Fluent in 9 languages, 4 of them dialects most universities didn't even have textbooks for. He had spent the last 3 years documenting burial route speech patterns for a nonprofit that ran out of funding 8 months ago. Now he cleaned floors. He pushed the bucket toward the far wall, kept his breathing steady, kept his face blank, but his ears were wide open. The negotiation happening at that table, the 116 men in $1,000 suits were conducting through 4 different interpreters, was falling apart. Ezra could hear it, not just in the tone, in the actual words. The lead interpreter kept translating a phrase as transportation arrangement. Ezra's jaw tightened. That wasn't what the word meant. The dialect being spoken, a layered, hybrid tongue that blended 2 Eastern border languages with old trade route pidgin, didn't have a clean word for transportation. When used in that specific construction with that specific suffix, it meant something else. Something older. Something that had nothing to do with cargo or supply chains. It was a route word. A concealment word. The kind used when you needed to move something or someone without a record. Ezra's hand tightened on the mop handle. 17 translators had already been brought in over 3 days. 17. He had heard the security staff talking about it in the break room. 17 experts, flown in from 4 countries, and not one of them could get the deal to close because not one of them could decode what the other side was actually asking for. They thought this was a trade agreement. It wasn't. Ezra set his mop against the wall, reached for a rag, started wiping down the baseboards, stayed low, stayed invisible, kept listening. One of the men at the table, the one doing most of the speaking, the one the others deferred to with a slight lean whenever he shifted in his chair, was using burial route language. Ezra had spent 2 years learning it in the field. He had sat in underground schools in Louisiana and Ohio and outside Memphis, teaching displaced Omega children how to read and write in languages their parents had used to stay alive. He knew this dialect in his bones. And what that man was saying, it wasn't a shipping route. It was a person route, a body route, the kind of route that got set up when you needed to move Omegas across state lines without paperwork, without consent, without anyone asking questions. Ezra's chest went cold. He straightened slowly, looked toward the far end of the room, through the tinted glass partition that separated the negotiation floor from the executive observation deck. He could see figures up there, vague shapes, men standing in shadow watching the proceedings below. One of them wasn't moving, just standing, arms loose at his sides, head slightly tilted, watching. Ezra couldn't see his face clearly through the glass. But something about the way that man stood, the sheer stillness of him, the weight of his presence even through 2 inches of darkened glass, made the hair on the back of Ezra's neck rise. He had felt that before, a long time ago, in a different life. He pulled his eyes away, focused on the baseboard, focused on breathing. The lead translator was botching another phrase, this time something about delivery confirmation. Ezra's stomach turned. In burial route language, that phrase didn't mean confirmation of goods. It meant arrival of persons. Unrecorded. The deal was about to be approved. Signed. Closed. And 18 people in this room, including the 4 interpreters, had no idea what they were actually agreeing to. Ezra stared at his hands. His knuckles were pale against the dark rag. His whole body was vibrating with the kind of tension that has nowhere to go. He had spent 3 years teaching people who couldn't protect themselves. He had spent 8 months broke and silent because the system didn't fund quiet work. He had spent every day since losing the school trying to convince himself that he had done enough, that there was nothing left for him to do. But he was standing in a room right now, and the people at that table were about to finalize a deal that moved human beings like packages. He could say nothing, walk out, finish his shift, or he could speak. The risk wasn't small. If he opened his mouth, they would know he understood. They would want to know how. They would start asking questions about who he was and how he got in and what he knew and why he knew it. And once people in rooms like this started asking questions about a man like Ezra Okafor, those questions did not stop at his employment record. He stood up slowly, turned around. The lead translator was nodding, moving toward the signature page. One of the suited men on the other side of the table was reaching into his jacket for a pen. Ezra's voice came out quiet, barely above a whisper, but in a room this silent, it landed like a stone dropped on glass. That's not what he said. Everything stopped. 16 heads turned. And from behind the tinted glass on the observation deck, the still figure moved for the first time. No one moved. Not the translators. Not the suited men at the table. Not the security guards stationed near the doors with their hands still folded in front of them like they weren't sure whether to draw or just watch. The only person who had moved was Ezra Okafor, and he was already regretting it. Not because he was wrong. He was not wrong. He was regretting it because every single set of eyes in that room had found him, and none of them were looking at him with anything close to welcome. The lead translator, the sharp-jawed one in the gray suit, let out a short, clipped sound, almost a laugh. He turned to the nearest colleague and said something in quick, dismissive French. Ezra understood it without effort. He said, "The cleaning boy thinks he speaks." Ezra did not react. He set the rag down on the edge of a nearby shelf, stood straight, clasped his hands in front of him. One of the security guards by the door took a step forward. "Sir, you need to return to your duties. Let him speak." The voice came from behind the glass. Low. Measured. The kind of voice that doesn't have to raise itself because it has never once in its life needed to. The observation deck door opened. A man walked through it, tall, dark-skinned, broad through the shoulders, wearing a white shirt open at the collar with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. No jacket, no tie, no visible effort to perform authority because he didn't need to perform it. He was Damien Ashford Cross. And the moment he walked into the room, every other body in it shifted slightly, leaned back, made space. Ezra had not seen Damien Ashford Cross in 11 years. He looked older, harder. There were lines around his eyes that weren't there before and a stillness in his face that hadn't been there when he was 23 and still figuring out what kind of man he was going to be. He had apparently decided, judging by the room they were currently standing in. Damien stopped at the head of the table, looked at Ezra for a long moment. Really looked, not the hollow assessment the translators had given him, but something deeper and more careful that lasted 3 full seconds before he broke it. "What did he say?" Damien asked. He was talking to Ezra, not the translators. The lead translator stepped forward immediately. "Mr. Ashford Cross, this is a maintenance worker. He has no credentials." "I didn't ask about his credentials." Damien didn't look at the translator. "I asked what the man said." He looked back at Ezra. "Go ahead." The room was completely still. Ezra took one breath, steadied himself. Then he looked at the man across the table, the one who had been speaking the burial route dialect, and spoke directly to him. Not in English, in the dialect itself. He asked, calmly, in that man's own tongue, "Will you let me translate what you said?" Exactly. Not what they told him. The man across the table stared at Ezra. Then something shifted in his face. A small, careful opening. He said yes. Ezra turned to Damien. And then he translated. Not the cleaned-up version. Not the version that made everything sound like a legitimate supply chain discussion. He translated the actual language, the buried grammar, the coded phrasing, the specific construction of words that meant something terrible in their original form. He laid it out sentence by sentence, quietly and completely, while the room held its breath. By the time he finished, two of the suited men across the table had gone pale. One of them stood up. "That is not," he started. "Sit down," Damien said. He hadn't moved from the head of the table. He hadn't raised his voice. He said it the way you say sit down to someone you have already decided you are done pretending to be polite with. The man sat. The lead translator turned to Damien with both hands open, the posture of someone trying to explain why a fire isn't that serious while the building is burning. "Sir, we have been working from certified translations. You've been working from wrong translations." Damien's eyes moved back to Ezra. "All 17 of them. Is that right?" Ezra said, "Yes." "How long have you known this dialect?" "About 12 years. I taught it." Something crossed Damien's face. It was quick. There and gone, but Ezra caught it. A flicker of something old. He filed it away. Damien looked around the room slowly. The lead translator, the 3 assistants, the security staff, the men at the table, some of whom were already reaching for phones that had been confiscated at the door. "Everyone out," Damien said. "Mr. Ashford-Cross." "I said everyone out. Translators, advisors, security. Step out into the hall and wait there. Take your materials." He paused. "Leave the signature pages." No one argued. That was the thing about Damien Ashford-Cross. No one argued with him. They gathered their things with varying levels of barely concealed panic and filed out the door, the lead translator casting one last look back at Ezra that was half fury and half something that looked almost like fear. The door closed. The room was quiet. Damien Ashford-Cross and Ezra Okafor stood in a $12,000 conference room with a deal unsigned on the table between them, and 11 years of unspoken things hanging in the air. Damien was the one who finally moved. He walked to the far end of the table, pulled out a chair and sat down. He looked at Ezra steadily. "You always knew more than you said," he said. It wasn't quite an accusation. It wasn't quite a compliment. It was just a truth, stated plainly, in a tone that was quieter than anything Ezra had heard from him in the last 11 years. Which, granted, was nothing, because they hadn't spoken in 11 years, but still. Ezra stayed where he was. "The deal," he said. "What happens to it now?" "That's not what I'm asking about right now." "I know." Ezra met his eyes. "I'm making it what you're asking about." A pause. Then Damien leaned back slightly. "The deal is dead. I don't do business on false terms." They weren't false to the other side. They thought you knew what you were agreeing to. Something moved through Damien's expression. Complicated. The kind of complicated that takes years to build. Did they? They thought your team was negotiating in bad faith, using the translator gap as cover. Damien was quiet for a moment. Then he looked down at the signature pages on the table. "How long have you been working here?" 3 weeks. "As maintenance. As whatever paid." Damien looked up. He held Ezra's gaze for a long moment. Not the calculated assessment of a man running a meeting, but something rawer and less managed. Something that had been sitting somewhere in him for a long time, waiting for a room quiet enough to surface. He said, "I never forgot you." It landed soft, like he hadn't planned it, like it slipped out from somewhere he wasn't keeping careful watch on. Ezra opened his mouth. And then Damien's phone buzzed. He looked at it. His face changed instantly, not dramatically, just a degree of tightening around the jaw. The stillness of a man receiving information he was not ready for. He stood up, set the phone on the table face down, looked at Ezra with something new in his eyes. "The deal was already triggered," he said. "Before this meeting. A preliminary route was activated 4 hours ago." Ezra's breath stopped. 4 hours ago. Which meant the route was already moving. Which meant people were already moving. They were alone in the conference room for less than 6 minutes before Damien was on the phone with 3 different people at once. Ezra watched him work. Calm, clipped, efficient. One call overlapping the next, each sentence landing like something that had been pre-planned but was being deployed faster than intended. Damien moved to the window, turned his back to the room, spoke quietly. Ezra sat down at the table. The signature pages were still there. The pen someone had started reaching for was still there, cap off, sitting at an angle on the polished surface like a small abandoned mistake. He thought about the phrase again, the route word, the confirmation phrasing that meant arrival of persons. For hours ago, he did the math without wanting to. If the route had been activated 4 hours ago, and the meeting was supposed to finalize the paperwork, the legitimate-looking paperwork that would give it a legal veneer retroactively, then the people running this weren't amateurs. They had built a buffer, in case the meeting ran long, in case something fell through. The signing was never the real moment. The signing was just the cover story. Damien hung up the last call, stood at the window with his back still turned. His shoulders were tight under the white shirt. "I had no idea what the actual arrangement was," he said. He wasn't asking Ezra to believe him. He was saying it the way people say things they need to say out loud, to the room, to themselves. "My acquisition team brokered the introduction. They told me it was a cross-border logistics partnership. Do you believe them?" "No." He turned around. "Not anymore." Ezra looked at him. "What did you think it was when it started feeling wrong?" Damien was quiet for a moment. 6 weeks ago. A subcontractor I've never heard of started appearing in the documents. Small line items. Transport and intake. I asked about it. My team said it was standard for this kind of deal. His jaw tightened. I let it go. Because the money was good. Because I trusted the wrong people. He pulled out the chair across from Ezra and sat down. Both things can be true. Ezra nodded slowly. He wasn't going to argue that. He wasn't here to judge. He was here because he had been mopping a floor and heard the wrong words in the right language and made a choice he couldn't unmake. "What happens now?" he asked. "I need to know where the route goes." Damien leaned forward. "You said you taught this dialect? Taught it where?" "Displaced pack settlements. 6 states over about 4 years. Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, Ohio, 2 circuits in Missouri. You knew people in those communities." "I know people." Present tense. Ezra held his gaze. "I still have contacts in 3 of those circuits." Damien studied him. "I want to hire you. Officially. Tonight." "As what?" "Translator. Consultant. Whatever title makes the next conversation easier." He paused. "I need someone who knows what's actually being said. Not just what the words mean on paper. What they mean in the mouth of the person saying them." Ezra looked at the table, at the signature pages, at the pen lying at its small defeated angle. "I'm not doing this for you," he said. Damien nodded. "I know. I'm doing it because there are people on a route right now who don't know where they're going. I know that too. And I'm not going to be managed. I'm not staff you can redirect when it gets inconvenient. If I find something, I tell you what it is, and we act on it." "Agreed." Ezra looked up. "You agreed fast. Because you're the only person in this building who actually knows what's happening." Damien stood. "And because you have always been better at this than you give yourself credit for." There was a pause. The kind that has weight behind it. The kind that means something is being said inside the silence. "We should talk," Ezra said carefully, "about the rest of it. But not here." "No, not here." Damien was already moving toward the door. He glanced back once. "My car is in the lower garage. Level B2. You have about 4 minutes before my security team returns to this floor and makes everything significantly more complicated." Ezra stood up. "You're not going to call off the deal through official channels first?" "I already sent the termination notice. 2 minutes ago." Damien pushed the door open. "The problem is, the people running the route don't care about termination notices. They made it to the elevator without incident. The hallway was empty. The translators and advisors apparently still clustered somewhere near the front of the floor, waiting in the charged silence of people who were already rehearsing what they were going to say when they were asked to explain what happened. Damien's car was a dark sedan. No visible markings. A driver who was already running the engine and didn't ask questions. They slid into the back seat and the car moved before the doors were fully closed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Damien's voice came from behind him, quieter than it had been all night. "Come back." It wasn't a dramatic line. It didn't reach for anything. It was just 2 words from a man who had already lost things he hadn't planned to lose and was not interested in adding to that list. Ezra didn't turn around. "I plan to." He went down the hallway, through the back door, into the dark street. He had one stop to make before the compound. One conversation he needed to have. Not with a criminal, not with a contact, not with a journalist. He scrolled to the name again. Hossein Kemderim. His thumb hovered. He pressed call. It rang once, twice. On the 3rd ring someone picked up. And the first thing Ezra heard, before the voice, before the hello, before anything, was the sound of a car engine in the background. A moving car, heading east. His hand went still around the phone. Because there was only one place east of where Hossein Kemderim had any reason to be at 3 in the morning. Only one location in that direction that mattered tonight. Ezra already knew. He had known since the moment Damien said the word Memphis. He just hadn't let himself say it yet. And then he heard the second sound through the phone. Underneath the engine, distant but clear. A voice he recognized. Low, authoritative. The same voice from the recorded threat message. The voice of the man running the compound. And Hossein's voice answering it. Ezra ended the call. Stood on the empty street. The air was cold. A car moved past him without slowing. He thought of the children he had taught. The ones who sat in underground classrooms and learned to read in languages the world had decided didn't count. The ones who had trusted him with their presence because he had shown up, consistently over years with no agenda other than to teach them. He thought about what it costs when someone uses trust as a door. He put the phone in his pocket. He started walking. The compound was 40 minutes away. He had made his calls. Kachuravas was positioned. Celestine would keep Damien stable. The route was still moving, but it was moving toward a location that was no longer secret. What happened next depended entirely on Ezra Okafor walking into a building he had never been in, alone, using only language. The one thing he had ever been genuinely, undeniably, irreplaceably good at. He walked, and somewhere behind him, in a clinic that smelled like eucalyptus, a man pressed his hand against his side and stared at the ceiling and waited. The message would come, or it wouldn't. Either way, tonight had already crossed a line that neither of them could come back from. Ezra reached the end of the block, turned east. He did not look back. He walked through the front gate. No disguise, no weapon. Just Ezra Okafor in the same jacket he had been wearing since yesterday morning, with gauze tape in one pocket and a phone with 3 recorded calls in the other. The compound was a converted distribution center, the kind of building that used to hold furniture or auto parts, now holding something else entirely. 2 loading bays, a chain link perimeter. Floodlights mounted high on the corners pointing outward, which meant whoever designed the security was more worried about people seeing in than people getting out. That told him something. A man at the gate looked him over, said nothing, opened it. They were expecting him. That was either good or very bad, and Ezra had made his peace with not knowing which before he took the first step onto the property. They walked him through the loading bay, past stacked pallets, past 2 men with earpieces who watched him the way dogs watch something they haven't been told to bite yet, and into a wide interior room that smelled like concrete dust and generator fuel. Folding tables, laptops, a dry erase board on the wall covered in route lines and timestamps that someone had started erasing but hadn't finished. Ezra looked at the board without being obvious about it, absorbed what he could in 3 seconds. Then they put him in a chair. 3 men sat across from him. The one in the center, the one with the voice from the recording, the one running this, was named Calhoun Priest. Ezra knew the name from his 3rd phone call. Mid-50s. Former logistics contractor. The kind of man who learned early that moving things invisibly was its own industry, and spent the next 20 years building infrastructure for people who needed that specific service. He looked at Ezra the way people look at a tool they're deciding whether to use or discard. "You speak the dialect," Priest said. "No greeting. No setup." "Yes," Ezra said. "How many routes can you decode?" Ezra looked at him steadily. "Depends on the origin region and the generation. I know 6 distinct burial route variants. 4 of them fluently." Priest leaned back. The 2 men beside him didn't move. "We've been losing product at handoff points," Priest said. "Miscommunication between origin coordinators and receiving teams. People aren't ending up where they're supposed to." "Product." Ezra kept his face still. That word landed in his chest like a stone, and he left it there. He could not react to it here. "Not yet." "I can help with that," he said. And then he started talking. Not the truth, not entirely. He gave them enough real information to sound credible, enough accuracy about burial route language to establish his value, and enough deliberate imprecision in the structural details to do exactly what he needed to do. He started creating confusion they wouldn't notice for 20 minutes. The first one was small. A handoff phrase that, translated the way he gave it, would route a receiving team to the wrong warehouse district, east side instead of west. It sounded correct. The grammar held. If you didn't know the origin variant of the dialect, you would write it down and use it and not understand why nothing arrived where it was supposed to. The second one was bigger. A coordination phrase used between 2 rival factions that shared parts of the same route. One from the Eastern Corridor, one operating out of a separate network that had been absorbed into Priest's operation 6 months ago. The 2 factions still didn't fully trust each other. Ezra knew that from his calls. He translated the coordination phrase with just enough tonal shift to make it read as a challenge rather than a greeting. An accusation rather than a confirmation. He watched one of the men at the table type it into a message and hit send. Pause on that. That moment mattered. Because what Ezra had just done, sitting in a folding chair in a compound he had walked into alone, was detonate something. Slowly. With language. The way you detonate a building by pulling out the right support beam rather than setting fire to the roof. He kept his hands loose in his lap. Kept his voice steady. Kept going. 15 minutes in, Priest's phone buzzed. He looked at it. His jaw shifted. 18 minutes in, a second phone, belonging to one of the men at the side tables, buzzed twice rapidly. That man stood up, moved to the corner, and had a low, tense conversation that Ezra could hear fragments of and understood completely. The Eastern Corridor team was not happy. 22 minutes in, a door opened at the far end of the room, and Hossein Kemderim walked through it. He stopped when he saw Ezra. For 1 second, just one, something moved across his face. Not guilt exactly, not surprise, something in between. The expression of a man who had calculated that this moment might come and had decided, somewhere along the way, that he could live with it when it did. Ezra looked at him. He didn't say his name. Didn't point. Didn't signal anything to anyone in the room. He just looked at Osei with the kind of stillness that says, "I know. And I have known for longer than you think. And this is the last conversation we are ever going to have." Osei looked away first. Priest was watching both of them. His eyes moved back and forth once, twice, then landed on Ezra with a new calculation in them. "You know him," Priest said. "We've met," Ezra said. Another buzz. Another tense phone call in the corner. The room was fragmenting, not loudly, not dramatically, just the quiet collapse of a system that had been told to move in 2 directions at once and was discovering it couldn't do both. Priest stood up. "There's a problem with the Eastern handoff." "I know," Ezra said. Priest looked at him sharply. "The phrase you sent," Ezra said calmly, "was from the wrong variant. The Eastern team uses a different construction for confirmation. What you sent them reads as a territorial claim." He paused. "They think you're moving on their territory. A beat. I can fix it," Ezra said. "Or I can let it run." The room went very quiet. And then Priest said something Ezra had been waiting for, not with words, but with his hands. He reached toward the table, toward the phone, to call someone, to either fix the problem or eliminate the person who had created it. Ezra's hand was already on his own phone. He pressed send on the message he had pre-written before he walked through the gate. 3 words, a location, a signal to Kachura Voss that everything inside was confirmed and the external team needed to move now. Then he stood up, looked at Priest, looked at the dry erase board with the half-erased route lines. "You should know," Ezra said, "that I recorded every translation I gave you tonight, and the phrasing I used in the second coordination message doesn't just cause confusion. It's also a route marker, a specific one. The kind that tells anyone who knows the dialect that something at this location is wrong." Priest stared at him. "I sent that marker to 6 people before I walked through your gate," Ezra said. 3 of them are journalists. 2 are community network leaders. 1 is a federal contact who has been building a case on cross-border Omega trafficking for 14 months. The room had gone completely still. Somewhere in the building, muffled but present, a sound reached them. Low and steady and growing. Not machinery, not a truck. Voices, multiple, moving fast. And then, from behind a locked door at the far left wall, a voice Ezra recognized. Damien Ashford Cross. Still alive, still here, and from the sound of it, not in the condition of a man who was going to stay quietly in a room much longer. Ezra didn't look at the door. He kept his eyes on Priest. "You have about 4 minutes," Ezra said, "before this building stops being yours." And then Hossein Kemderim, who had been standing in the corner saying nothing, watching everything, made a decision. He walked toward Priest, and he knelt, not to help him, not in surrender, in allegiance, in the specific, deliberate posture of a man choosing, at the last possible moment, which side of a line he was going to die on. Ezra looked at him for 1 long second. Then he looked away. Ezra didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The room was already fracturing on its own. 2 men at the side tables were on phones, both conversations overlapping, both urgent, and the noise from outside the building was getting closer and less patient. Priest was on his feet. His eyes were moving fast, door to door, man to man, landing on Ezra each time like a question he couldn't form. Osei was still kneeling, looking at the floor. Ezra looked at Osei for 3 seconds. Then he spoke, not in English, in the dialect, the burial route tongue. The one they had both learned in different ways, for entirely different reasons. He said, in that language, "Everything you said in this room for the last 4 months has been recorded. Not by me, by the people who recruited you. They record their assets, standard practice. And when this is over, they will use those recordings to make sure you carry the weight for all of it." Osei's head came up slowly. "They do not protect people who kneel," Ezra said, still in the dialect. "They protect people who are useful. The moment you're a liability, you become evidence." Priest was watching the exchange with the focused frustration of someone listening to a conversation he cannot enter. "What are you saying to him?" Priest demanded. Ezra ignored him. He pulled out his phone, opened the audio files, 3 of them recorded over the last hour inside this building. The translations, the coordination phrases. Priest's own voice asking Ezra to help them fix a handoff problem that Ezra had deliberately broken. He pressed play on the first one, loud enough for the room to hear. Priest's voice filled the space, clear, specific, incriminating. One of the men at the side table stood up and took a step forward. Ezra spoke without looking at him. "There are 6 copies of that recording on 6 different servers. If this phone goes offline in the next 30 minutes, they upload automatically." He paused. "Sit down." The man sat. This matters, because what Ezra was doing right now wasn't violence. It wasn't a weapon, not in any physical sense. It was language, turned sideways, sharpened at both ends. He had walked into this building with nothing but his voice and his knowledge and the recordings he had been careful enough to make, and he was dismantling a network that had operated for years in the gap between what people said and what they meant. The noise outside was very close now. Priest looked at the door, back at Ezra. His calculation was visible, the math of a man deciding whether flight or fight produces better odds. He chose a third option. He picked up the phone on the table, dialed, held it to his ear, and said, in a voice that was steady and cold, "Clean the Eastern house. Now, all of it." Ezra moved, not toward Priest, toward the locked door on the far left wall. He covered the distance in 8 steps, tried the handle locked, knocked twice with the flat of his hand. "Damien!" A beat. Then from behind the door, Damien's voice, rougher than usual, lower. The voice of someone who had been in a small space for too long but was absolutely, completely functional. "I'm here." Step back from the door. A pause. "Ezra, there are 2. I know." Step back. He turned, looked at the room. Priest, who was still on the phone. At the 2 side table men who were watching him. At Osei, who had gotten to his feet and was standing with his hands at his sides and the expression of someone who had arrived, finally and too late, at the correct decision. Ezra looked at Priest. "Tell them to stand down," Ezra said. Priest said nothing. "The Eastern house is already gone," Ezra said. "Your contact at that location was identified 2 hours ago. The call you just made went through, but there's no one there to answer it." He held Priest's gaze. "Your network has 3 active corridors left. Want me to tell you which ones I've already flagged to the federal contact?" Priest lowered the phone. He did not say stand down. He didn't have to. The men in the room read the shift in him, that specific collapse of certainty that happens when a person realizes the map they were using is wrong, and they stepped back. Ezra picked up a chair, crossed to the locked door. One hard swing at the handle housing, which was older than everything else in the building, and gave up almost immediately. The door opened. Damien was standing 3 feet back, exactly as asked, hands loose at his sides, shirt still carrying the stain of last night's wound, but standing straight and completely steady. He looked at Ezra. Then he looked past him at the room. He took it in quickly. Priest. Say. The 2 standing men. The phones. The dry erase board. He looked back at Ezra. "You walked in here alone?" "Yes." "With a recording and a translation strategy?" "Yes." Damien exhaled. One short, compressed breath. The kind that contains an entire argument he had already decided not to have. "Okay." He walked into the room. And the moment he did, the moment Damien Ashford-Cross walked out of that locked room and stood at full height in that space, something changed. Not loudly. Just the air pressure of the room shifting around a man who, even at reduced capacity, even having spent a night locked in a back room with a bullet wound, took up space in a way that made other men recalibrate. Priest looked at him. Damien looked back. "Your syndicate's recorded communications are going to every major investigative outlet in the country within the hour," Damien said. His voice was level. "I've authorized the transfer personally. My legal team has been holding the documents since 6 this morning." Ezra glanced at him. He hadn't known that. Damien didn't look back. "The moment I was taken, my team activated a contingency. Everything tied to this network, the shell companies, the route documentation, the intake records, goes public. That was the agreement I made with my attorney before I agreed to testify." Priest's face went flat. "You agreed to testify," he said. "Not a question. A recalculation." "Months ago," Damien said. "Before tonight. Before any of this." He paused. "I spent 6 weeks building a case with a federal unit. The deal tonight was never going to close. It was a collection event." The room held that for a moment. Ezra looked at Damien. Something was moving behind his eyes. Not quite surprise, not quite betrayal, something more complex. The specific feeling of finding out that the person standing next to you had a plan you didn't know about, and the plan was good, and you're not sure whether to be angry or relieved, and you're a little bit of both. Outside, close now, directly outside, sirens. Multiple. The floodlights on the exterior cut off. All of them at once. The room went to emergency lighting, dim, red-edged. Someone at the side table made a move toward the far exit. The far exit opened before he reached it. The city outside the windows was doing what cities do, moving, lit, indifferent. People walking. Traffic shifting. the ordinary noise of the world continuing without awareness of any specific emergency. Ezra broke the silence first. How long have you known? About the deal? 6 weeks of suspicion, 3 hours of certainty. No. Ezra looked at him. About me. Working there. Damien was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. 4 days. And you waited. I was trying to figure out why. Why I was there? Why you hadn't left? Damien turned his head to look at him properly. When you figured out what was happening in that room, and I'm guessing it wasn't tonight, why didn't you walk out? File a report. Go somewhere safe. You stayed. Ezra didn't answer immediately. He thought about the route words. About the children he had taught to read in languages the school system had never heard of. About a nonprofit that ran out of funding and a network of people who had depended on it, and the specific weight of helplessness that comes from watching something necessary disappear. Because walking out doesn't stop it, he finally said. Damien held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. Once, like something had been confirmed. He opened his mouth to say something else. The back window exploded. Not glass breaking inward. The sound was sharper. A crack followed by a hiss of air and the driver shouting once, short and clipped. The car swerved, hard left, then correcting, and Damien threw his arm across Ezra's chest in the same instant he was ducking sideways, and the second shot took out the rear panel with a sound like metal being punched from the outside. Someone was shooting at the car. The driver was already accelerating, taking a corner too fast. Ezra grabbed the door handle and held on. Damien was on his phone in under 4 seconds. Not panicked, just urgent, relaying their location in short bursts. The third shot. This one hit, not the car. Damien made a sound. One sharp exhale, and his left hand dropped from the phone to his side. Ezra looked. There was blood coming through the white shirt just below his ribs. Not pouring, seeping. A graze or a through and through, impossible to tell which in the dark and moving vehicle. Damien pressed his hand against it. Kept talking on the phone. Ezra looked at him, at the blood darkening between his fingers, at the way Damien's voice stayed level even now, even through this, like he had trained himself so completely for control that even a gunshot wound got processed the same way as a difficult meeting. You're hit, Ezra said. I noticed. He lowered the phone. There's a safe house on Kellner. 12 minutes. You need a hospital. I need 12 minutes and a safe house. He looked at Ezra. His face was pale now, just slightly, the first real sign of anything other than calm. Can you get us there if the driver can't? Ezra looked at the driver. Still upright, still moving, hands white on the wheel. He looked back at Damien. Yes, he said. Damien exhaled. His hand was still pressed against his side. His eyes stayed open and focused, but there was something behind them now. Something that wasn't pain exactly but was adjacent to it. Something that looked, briefly, like relief that there was someone in the seat next to him. The car kept moving. The shots had stopped. For now. But Ezra already knew, whoever had found them that fast had not done it by accident. Someone in that building had made a call. The car made it to Kellner Street. Barely. The driver pulled into an alley between a dry cleaner and a shuttered print shop, cut the engine, and sat for 3 seconds without speaking before Ezra realized the man's breathing was wrong. Short, shallow. The way breathing sounds when someone is running on adrenaline that is running out. Can you walk? Ezra asked him. Yeah. The driver looked at his own hands on the wheel. Yeah, I'm good. He wasn't completely good. But he wasn't down. That was enough for right now. Ezra got out of the car, looked both ways down the alley. Nothing moving. The street beyond it was a regular block. A bodega lit up on one corner, a laundromat still open, a few people walking with their hands in their pockets and their eyes on their phones. Ordinary. The kind of block that forgets things quickly. He opened Damien's door. Damien had his left arm pressed against his side and his phone already put away. He swung his legs out of the car and stood on his own, which told Ezra the wound was manageable, at least for now. There was blood on the seat. Not a catastrophic amount, but not a scratch either. Second floor, Damien said. His voice was still even. Above the print shop. Blue door. Ezra stayed at his elbow as they moved down the alley. Not touching him. Damien didn't look like the kind of man who accepted being held up, but close enough to catch him if his legs decided to stop cooperating. They didn't. He walked steady. A little tighter than normal. A little slower. But he walked. The driver followed behind them. The blue door had 3 locks. Damien produced keys from his jacket pocket with his right hand and opened all 3 without fumbling. Inside was a narrow staircase. They went up. The room above the print shop was sparse in the way safe houses always are, functional without being comfortable. 2 cots. A table. A cabinet with supplies that Ezra opened immediately and found what he was looking for. Gauze, tape, antiseptic, a sealed trauma kit still in its packaging. He turned around. Damien was sitting on the edge of one of the cots. He had already pulled his shirt loose and was looking down at the wound with the expression of someone assessing a problem they haven't decided is serious yet. It was a through and through. Clean channel, low on the left side, missed the major organs. Ezra had seen enough field injuries in his years in the settlements to know this one wouldn't kill him in the next hour. But it needed to be dressed properly or it would become something worse. "Take your shirt off," Ezra said. Damien did. Without comment. Ezra cleaned the wound. Damien sat still and let him. The driver had positioned himself near the window, watching the alley. Phone out. The room was quiet except for the sound of the street below and the occasional hiss of breath from Damien when the antiseptic hit. "Someone told them we were leaving," Ezra said. He wasn't asking. "Yes." "From inside the building." "Yes." "Your team." A pause. "Most likely." Ezra pressed gauze against the exit point and held it. "Who knew we were going to the garage?" "3 people. My assistant, my head of security, and the driver." Damien looked at the driver by the window. The driver looked back. Neither said anything, which said something. "You trust him?" Ezra asked quietly. "I've trusted him for 8 years," Damien said. "Tonight happened in front of him. He drove through it. I'll make my own assessment." "Fair enough." Ezra taped the dressing. Stood up. Stepped back. Damien reached for the shirt, then stopped. Set it aside. Looked at Ezra directly. "There's something you should know." "About the route?" "About who set it up." He paused. "One of the subcontractors listed in the paperwork, the one doing intake and transport, their shell company was registered under an address I recognized. It's a building in East Memphis. I know that building because I visited it once, 3 years ago." Ezra waited. "It was a school," Damien said. "A language school. For displaced Pacs. It had been shut down about 2 months before I visited. The nonprofit that ran it lost its funding and closed." The air in the room changed. Ezra heard it. The specific silence that falls when 2 pieces of information arrive at the same place at the same time. "My school," he said. Damien nodded. Ezra turned away from him, took 2 steps toward the table and stood there with his hands flat on the surface. His mind was moving fast, too fast to follow cleanly through the timeline of it. The school closing. The building sitting empty. Someone who knew the address, who had been watching, who had known the network. Filing papers and turning that empty building into a registration point for a trafficking route. Someone from inside his network. He had given that address to dozens of people over the years. Teachers, volunteers, parents of students, community contacts, settlement leaders, people he had trusted with more than just addresses. One of them had taken what he built and hollowed it out. "Ezra." Damien's voice was quiet. "I know." He turned around. His face was composed. His hands were still on the table. "I know who it could be. You don't have to." "I said I know." He held Damien's eyes. "And when I know for certain, you'll be the second person to find out." Damien looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded. "Okay." The driver's phone buzzed. He answered it, listened for about 10 seconds, and turned from the window. "Sir." His voice had a new note in it, clipped and careful. "There's movement on the secondary route. East Corridor." Two vehicles confirmed moving toward the state line. Damien was on his feet before the sentence finished. He pulled on the bloody shirt without hesitation. There was nothing else to put on, and looked at Ezra. "We need to move. You just had a bullet go through your side." "I know. You need to rest or you're going to start bleeding through that dressing in about 40 minutes. I'll take that under advisement." He was already moving toward the door. Ezra grabbed the remaining gauze and the tape and put them in his jacket pocket. He looked around the room once, the table, the cots, the clinical emptiness of the place, and thought about everything that had changed in the last 3 hours. He thought about who he had been this morning, cleaning floors, head down, living inside the particular silence of a man who has decided to stop fighting because fighting hadn't worked. He thought about what he had just heard, about his school, his address, his people. Something in him settled into a new shape. He followed Damien down the stairs. They made it back to the alley. The driver had already gotten the car turned around. They were moving again inside 45 seconds, new route, slower, lights off until they hit the main road. For 6 blocks it was quiet. Then Damien's phone lit up. A message, not a call, a message, from an unknown number. He looked at it. His face went very still. He turned the screen toward Ezra. It was a voice message. He played it. A recording. 3 seconds. Static-edged, slightly compressed, the kind of audio that gets captured on a cheap device in a room with concrete walls. And on it, clearly, unmistakably, Damien's own voice. Speaking. The timestamp said it was from 1 hour ago. From inside the safe house. The room had been wired. And the text message beneath the audio said simply, "Come alone. Or the Alpha doesn't make it to morning." Ezra stared at the screen. The car kept moving. Damien's jaw was tight. His hand was pressed against his side again where the dressing was already showing red at the edges. And Ezra understood with complete clarity. Whoever had set this up had not been improvising tonight. They had been waiting, planning, using the deal, the translators, the safe house, all of it, waiting for exactly this moment. For Damien to be vulnerable. And for Ezra to be standing next to him when it happened. Ezra put Damien somewhere safe before dawn. Not the safe house that was burned now, useless. Not a hospital. Too many questions, too many records, too many ways for the wrong people to find a name in a system. He used a contact. A woman named Celestine Broward who ran a licensed massage and physical therapy clinic in a narrow building off a side street that smelled like eucalyptus and old wood. Celestine had been a medic in a PAC settlement network in Tennessee before she got her license. She did not ask why a man with a gunshot wound was being brought to her clinic at 2 in the morning by someone she hadn't seen in 4 years. She just told them to come through the back. Ezra sat outside the treatment room on a folding chair and listened to Celestine work. Damien didn't make noise. Celestine did, asking him to breathe, to hold still, to confirm sensation in specific places. The sounds of someone being put back together. The driver was gone. Ezra had sent him 2 blocks away with instructions to watch and not communicate with anyone until Ezra made contact. He was alone in the hallway. He had his phone out. He had the text message on Damien's phone memorized, the number, the timestamp, the audio clip. He had not responded to it. That was intentional. The moment you respond to a threat message, you confirm you received it. You hand them your timeline. He stared at the wall. He thought. The person who sent that message knew 3 things. Where the safe house was, that Damien was there, and that he was worth threatening. That last part was specific. Not just the Alpha is injured. The Alpha doesn't make it to morning. The phrasing mattered. It was designed to produce urgency. To make Ezra move fast and alone without stopping to think. He was thinking. The route word. The school address. The safe house. Someone inside Damien's circle had fed information outward. And someone outside that circle had a reason to want Damien neutralized without killing him outright, which meant there was a use for him alive. Leverage. Signature. Name on a document that would make something appear legitimate. He pulled out his own phone. Scrolled through his contacts to a name he hadn't used in 14 months. Hossein Kemderim, former settlement coordinator in Missouri. The man who had held together 3 community networks across 2 counties when the funding disappeared and the infrastructure went with it. Ezra had trusted him with everything: schedules, student records, route maps for community movement. He had also trusted him with the East Memphis address. He stared at the name. Not yet. He needed more before he moved on a name. He put the phone down, stood up, walked the length of the hallway twice, came back. His mind kept landing on the same point. The trafficking route that had been activated was still moving. Damien couldn't act on it from a treatment table. Ezra had no authority to contact the route's operators, except that he did. Not authority. Something else. He had the language. He had the contacts. He had 11 years of community relationships with people who lived on the edges of systems like this, who knew where the routes ran because they had spent their lives staying out of the way of them. He sat back down. He made 3 calls in the next hour, each one quiet, each one using language the call's recipients would understand and that surveillance systems, if any were running on these numbers, would have a hard time parsing correctly. The first call confirmed the route's eastern corridor was real and active. 2 vehicles, moving toward a crossing point outside the official state line routes. The second call gave him a name, not a person, a location. A warehouse address in a town 40 minutes from where they were sitting, used historically as a transit point. The third call told him who owned the shell company that had rented it. He sat with that name for a minute. Then he called a 4th number. A journalist. A woman named Katura Voss who worked for an independent media outlet that had published 2 investigations on trafficking networks in the Southeast in the last 3 years and had the receipts to prove she wasn't going to sit on information when lives were involved. He didn't give her the name. Not yet. He gave her the warehouse address and told her to have someone positioned within the hour. He had just made a commitment. He went back into the treatment room. Celestine was finishing. Damien was lying back on the table, shirt off, dressing clean and tight. He looked pale but conscious and controlled, the specific kind of controlled that means a man is managing his pain through willpower rather than medication, which was either impressive or deeply unwise and was probably both. Damien looked at Ezra the moment he walked in. "You were on the phone." "Yes." "Who did you call?" Ezra sat down in the chair near the table. "People who can help. And a journalist who will make sure what happens tonight doesn't disappear." Damien's expression shifted. Not with anger, with something more complicated. "You didn't consult me." "No. I'm not a resource you can deploy without." "I know." Ezra met his eyes. "I also know you're lying on a table and the people who put that threat message together are counting on you to be reactive right now. They want you scared. Or angry. Or moving fast in the wrong direction." Pause. "They want me to come alone," Ezra said. "That's what the message said. They're not asking for you. They're using you as leverage against me." Damien was quiet for a moment. "Why you?" "Because I'm the one who stopped the deal. Because I know the language. Because they need to know how much I know and who I've told." He folded his hands. "If I walk into that compound, I'm not walking in as someone being rescued. I'm walking in as someone they need information from. That's different. That's leverage I can use. Or they'll just kill you." "They won't. Not until they know what I know." "Ezra." Damien sat up slowly. He put his feet on the floor. His hands were on the edge of the table and his eyes were steady. "I don't want you walking into that place alone. I know. I'm serious. I know that too." Ezra looked at him. "I'm not doing it because I want to. I'm doing it because the route is moving right now. And I'm the only person in this situation who can walk into that room, speak their language, and come back out with what we need to bring the whole thing down." Celestine, from the corner where she was putting away her supplies, said nothing. She was very carefully not involved in this conversation. Damien stared at Ezra for a long moment. Then he exhaled. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to rest. Let the wound close. Be reachable in 2 hours." Ezra stood. "And I need you to start making a list of everyone who knew about that safe house. Tonight, while I'm gone. By the time I'm back, I want to know exactly who sold us." Damien nodded. Once. His jaw was tight. Ezra turned to leave. Ezra. He stopped in the doorway. Federal agents. 4 of them. Organized. Fast. Not interested in conversation. And behind them, outside, through the now open door, Ezra could see camera lights. News cameras. Katura Voss had positioned more than one person. Priest was being cuffed. The 2 side-table men were being cuffed. The agents moved through the room with the efficiency of people executing a plan they had rehearsed. Jose didn't run. He stood still while an agent approached him. He looked at Ezra across the room. One last look, and Ezra held it for exactly as long as it took to understand what was in it. Not an apology. Not exactly. Something older and less clean. The face of a man who had made a choice he believed was survival and had discovered, tonight, that survival and integrity are not always the same direction. Ezra looked away. He looked at the dry erase board, the half-erased routes. He pulled out his phone, opened the camera, and photographed it. Every line, every timestamp, every notation that hadn't been erased yet. Then he walked to the door. Damien fell into step beside him. They stepped outside into the cold air. Cameras to the right. Agents and vehicles everywhere. The compound had gone from controlled to entirely not within the space of 11 minutes, and it looked exactly as messy as that kind of collapse always looks. Men in handcuffs, vehicles blocking the gate, someone's radio cutting in and out. And then, from the building behind them, from inside where the route maps were and the laptops and all the careful infrastructure of a network that had run for years on the gap between what was said and what was meant. A sound. Low. Then rising. An explosion. Not massive. Controlled. A secondary charge on the server room, Ezra would learn later. Someone had triggered a data wipe. The force of it pushed them both forward a step. Ezra caught himself on the door frame. Damien caught himself on Ezra's arm. One hand, brief, released the moment his footing was solid. They stood in the open air and watched smoke rise from a narrow set of windows high on the wall. "Did you get what you needed?" Damien asked. He was looking at the building. Ezra thought about the recordings, the photographs, Katura's cameras, the 6 copies on 6 servers, the federal team who had walked in with documents already prepared. "Yes," he said. "So did I," Damien said quietly. They stood there for a moment. 2 men in the cold outside a burning server room, surrounded by the collapse of something that had operated in the dark for a very long time. Neither of them said the next thing. Not yet, but they were both thinking it. 3 days later, the story was everywhere. Not their names, not at first, but the network, the shell companies, the routes, the intake records that had been pulled from Priest's system before the data wipe caught everything. A federal spokesperson gave a brief statement. 2 investigative journalists, Katura Voss was one of them, published coordinated pieces within 6 hours of each other. By the end of the second day, 4 members of a government oversight committee had been named as connected to the shell companies. 4. Not low-level people. Not easily discarded names. Ezra sat in a rented apartment 2 miles from the clinic where Celestine had treated Damien and watched the news coverage with the specific heaviness of a man who knows what it cost to get here and is not yet sure the cost was worth it. His phone kept ringing. He answered some of the calls. Not all. On the 4th day, Damien came to the apartment. He knocked. Ezra opened the door. Damien walked in without being invited, which was a habit that apparently survived gunshot wounds and federal testimony and the public dismantling of a business empire he had spent 15 years building. He sat down at the kitchen table. He looked older than he had 3 days ago. Not dramatically, just the specific aging that happens when a person goes through something they cannot undo and the body records it. "The syndicate is still running," Damien said. Ezra turned from the window. "I know. Different name. Different registration. 3 of the corridor leaders weren't in the building that night. They've restructured." "I know that too." Damien looked at him. "How?" "Katura told me this morning. She's been tracking the shell company filings. 2 new registrations in the last 72 hours. Same structure. Different addresses." Damien set his hands flat on the table. He looked at them. "My acquisition team built part of the original infrastructure. Not knowingly. I want to be clear about that. But the financial architecture they created made it easier for Priest's network to operate underneath it. The shell layers, the offshore routing, things I approved because they were standard in my industry. He looked up. I approved them, he said. I didn't know what they were being used for, but I approved them. Ezra looked at him steadily. I know. You've known. Since the second day, when the financial documents were released. Damien nodded. Slow. The nod of someone confirming something they were afraid was true. And you didn't say anything. I was waiting to see what you would do with it. A silence. The apartment was quiet. Outside, the city moved the way it always moves, without awareness of any specific reckoning happening in any specific room. I'm going to disclose it, Damien said. Fully. My attorney is already preparing the filing. My financial empire, what's left of it after the asset freeze, is going to be restructured under independent oversight. Every deal connected to the Priest network gets unwound. Ezra said nothing. That means I lose most of it, Damien said. The businesses, the holdings, the infrastructure I've spent 15 years building. He exhaled. I've already accepted that. That's not what I'm thinking about, Ezra said. Damien looked at him. I'm thinking about the people on the routes that are still running. Ezra moved to the table. Sat down across from him. I'm thinking about the 3 corridor leaders who weren't in that building. I'm thinking about the new registrations Katura found. And I'm thinking about the fact that the network doesn't end because Priest is in custody. It ends when the infrastructure ends. And the infrastructure, he paused, is partly yours. The room held that. Damien didn't look away. Yes. So the question isn't whether you disclose. You should. You will. That's not the hard part. Ezra leaned forward slightly. The question is whether you're willing to take it all the way. Even the parts that expose how deep your money went. Even the parts that will end things you didn't intend to build. Damien was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something Ezra hadn't expected. I already agreed to testify. Ezra looked at him. Not just the first round. Full disclosure. Ongoing. Whatever the federal unit needs to trace the financial architecture completely. Damien held his gaze. I decided before tonight was over. Before the compound. Before the explosion. When I was sitting in that back room, listening through the door while you took apart a room full of people with nothing but a recording and a broken translation. He stopped. I decided then. Ezra sat back. He thought about the school. About the children. About the address on an East Memphis building that someone had hollowed out and turned into an intake point. He thought about what it would take, really take, to shut down something that had survived one night of exposure and already come back under a different name. They're going to issue a warrant, Ezra said. I know. For you specifically. For the financial infrastructure. It'll be civil first, then criminal depending on what the tracing uncovers. I know that too. Damien. Ezra met his eyes. They're going to arrest you. A pause. I know, Damien said. Quiet. Clear. The tone of a man who has already made his peace with a consequence and is now simply waiting for it to arrive. Ezra looked at him for a long moment. He thought about 11 years of silence between them. About a negotiation room and a mop and the specific moment a person decides to stop performing invisibility. About a car with a blown-out rear window and blood on a white shirt and a man who had said, I never forgot you, like it cost him something to say it. He thought about all the ways this was not the reunion either of them had imagined, in whatever part of themselves had still imagined it. Okay, Ezra said. That was all. Just okay. The word that means I see you and I'm not leaving and I understand what this costs. Damien looked down at the table. Something moved across his face. Not relief exactly, but the specific loosening that happens when a person has been holding something alone for a long time and is finally not holding it alone. 48 hours later, a warrant was issued for Damien Ashford-Cross. He was at his attorney's office when it arrived. He turned himself in before the end of the day, and Ezra Okafor did not go to the courthouse, did not stand on the steps, did not watch. He went back to work. The trial lasted 11 weeks. Ezra followed it the way you follow something that matters to you when you have decided not to be in the room for it. Through reports, through Kachura's dispatches, through the occasional call from Damien's attorney who had started including Ezra on certain updates because Damien had asked him to. Calhoun Priest pled guilty on the 4th week. The plea agreement required him to disclose every corridor leader still operating. 3 names. 2 were arrested within 10 days. The 3rd crossed a border and was still being tracked. Hossein Kemderim testified. That was the part Ezra had not seen coming. Not the testimony itself, but the content. Hossein had recorded his own contacts. For 8 months. Not for the feds. Not for Ezra. For himself. The specific self-protective instinct of a man who had gotten into something much bigger than he had understood and had quietly started building an exit ramp he might never have used. He used it. The recordings broke the Eastern Corridor case open in a way that the federal unit's existing evidence hadn't. 4 additional shell companies identified. 2 government officials, not committee members, actual agency staff with clearance, were named. Ezra sat with that for a long time. He did not forgive Hossein. That wasn't something he had decided against. It was something he had set down to deal with later, when the work was finished and later had not come yet. The syndicate's restructured operation was dismantled in week 7. The new registrations Kachura had found were connected directly to one of the corridor leaders Priest had named, and the federal unit moved fast. The new corridors collapsed within 48 hours of the arrests. The routes stopped. Not all routes. Ezra was not naive enough to believe that one case closed every door. But these routes, these specific corridors, these intake points, they stopped. On week 9, Ezra stood in front of a building in East Memphis. The school building. His address, the one that had been hollowed out and used as a registration point. He stood outside it for about 10 minutes. Then he went inside. The building was empty. The federal unit had cleared it. The paperwork had been seized, the equipment removed, the shell company dissolved. It was just a building again. He walked through it slowly. The classrooms were still there. The actual rooms, the boards, the chairs. Someone had used the main room for storage at some point and left boxes that weren't there when he taught here. Everything else was exactly as he remembered it. The smell of the walls. The particular way sound moved in the back classroom, a little more echo than the front because the ceiling was slightly higher. He stood in the back classroom for a long time. Then he took out his phone and called the former nonprofit's board chair, a woman named Adiz Whitmore who had been trying to reactivate the organization's 501(c)(3) status for 2 years on essentially no resources. "I have something to tell you," he said. She listened. Then she said, "How soon can you get the building back under our name?" He said, "I'm already in it." The trial concluded in week 11. Priest received 22 years. The 2 government officials lost their positions and were facing separate federal charges. 3 of Priest's corridor leaders were convicted. The 4th, still in transit, remained outstanding. Damien Ashford-Cross received 18 months. Reduced from the initial recommendation because of his cooperation, the depth of his voluntary disclosure, and the specific testimony he provided that connected the financial architecture to the government officials. Testimony that no other witness had been able to give. 18 months. His empire, as expected, was restructured under independent oversight. Most of the holdings were liquidated to satisfy civil penalties. What remained was a fraction, enough to operate a small private investment practice, nothing more. 15 years. Reduced to a fraction. In 11 weeks. Ezra received the sentencing report from Kachura on a Tuesday morning. He read it twice. Then he set his phone down and went back to what he had been doing, reviewing curriculum drafts for the reopened school, which was scheduled to accept its first students in 6 weeks. The school had a new name. Adiz had chosen it. The Burial Route Project, a name that meant something to the people who would come to it, and was opaque to everyone who hadn't lived inside those communities. That was intentional. Ezra had not gone to the sentencing. He had not gone to any of the hearings. He had been asked to testify, formally as a witness, and he had done so in writing, through a sworn statement that Damien's attorney said was one of the most precise documents he had read in 30 years of practice. Precise. That was a word Ezra could live with. The release date was set. Ezra knew it. He had known it since the sentencing. 18 months. The date arrived on a Thursday. He was in the back classroom of the school, teaching, or preparing to teach, the first actual session with the first actual cohort of 12 students who ranged in age from 8 to 16 and had in common that they had been displaced at some point, that their families had moved through networks that the formal system didn't track, and that most of them spoke at least 2 languages with no documentation to prove it. He was writing vocabulary on the board when his phone buzzed. A message. No name. Just a number he recognized. 3 words. "I'm out. Walking." Ezra looked at the message for a moment. Then he set the phone face down on the desk, turned back to the board, and did not go to meet him. Not yet. Not because he didn't want to. That was not the reason. The reason was more honest than that. He was standing in a classroom, in front of 12 children who had been through things that required the kind of quiet consistency that does not stop because something personal happens on a Thursday afternoon. He stayed. He taught. And later, 2 hours later, when the last student had left and the building was quiet again, he sat at the desk in the back classroom and thought about it. About Damien walking out of a federal facility on a Thursday with reduced status and no empire and 18 months of something nobody asks for. About the 3 words on a phone screen. About the fact that Damien had sent them to Ezra and not to anyone else, which was either a message or just a fact, and Ezra wasn't entirely sure which. He thought about what walking forward looked like. Not reunion. Not resolution. Not a dramatic moment on courthouse steps. Just 2 people who had come through the same fire from different angles, standing in whatever remained, deciding what to do next. The school was quiet. The building smelled faintly of erasable markers and old wood. He picked up the phone. He typed back. 4 words. Come to the school. Then he set the phone down, turned back to the curriculum draft, kept working. The message showed as delivered. Then read. Then nothing for a few minutes. Then the small sound of the building's front door opening. 14 months later, the Burial Route Project had 340 students across 4 cities. Not all of them were young. Some were adults, former settlement residents, displaced community members, people who had moved through systems that never recorded their passage and were now trying to build something with documented roots. The curriculum had expanded. 3 staff members, 2 rotating instructors from a university partnership Adiz had negotiated herself. A small, functional budget sourced from 4 separate grants and 1 private donor who had specifically requested anonymity. Ezra knew who the donor was. He had not told Adiz. He also had not confirmed it to Damien, who had never brought it up directly. They had an understanding, the kind that lives in the space between what is said and what is simply known. That some things could be done quietly and still count. Damien's life, 14 months out, was smaller than it had been. That was the right word for it. Not destroyed, not finished, just smaller. The private investment practice he had rebuilt from the remains of the oversight process had 4 clients and operated from a 2-room office in a city that was not the one he had built his empire in. He was not on any boards. He held no titles. He had no staff. He had his name reduced to its actual size. The third-party oversight report released 8 months ago had cleared him of any further criminal liability. The civil settlements were finalized. The appeal by 2 of the convicted corridor leaders had been denied 3 weeks ago. The network was gone. Not completely. Ezra did not believe in completely. There were always people who rebuilt, who re-registered, who found new gaps between what was said and what was meant. He tracked them. Kachura tracked them. The federal unit had a standing case file. But the specific infrastructure that had operated through Priest's system, through the shell company registered at an East Memphis address, through the burial route dialect that 17 translators couldn't decode, that specific machine was finished. On a Wednesday in early spring, Ezra got a call from Kachura. She didn't call with news often anymore. She sent links, documents, updates. When she called, it meant something. Remnants, she said. Ezra set down the curriculum revision he was reviewing. Which corridor? Missouri. New registration. Different name, different structure, but the intake language is the same. The phrasing. He knew it. Of course he knew it. Someone had salvaged the dialect templates. How far along? Early. 2 months maybe. No confirmed movement yet. Send me what you have. She did. He spent the next 4 hours going through it. By the end of the first hour, he had identified the variant. By the end of the second, he had 2 contact names in the Missouri Settlement Network who would know the registration addresses. By the end of the fourth, he had a memo drafted for the federal unit. He sent it. Then he sat back, looked at the ceiling of the back classroom, the one with the slightly higher ceiling, the one with the echo. He thought about what Katura had said. Remnants. That was always going to be the word. Not defeat. Not victory. Remnants. The part that reassembles. The part that finds a new name and starts again. His phone buzzed. A message from Damien. Short, the way his messages always were. He had become a man who did not over-explain. Heard from Katura? Ezra typed back. Yes. Working on it. A pause. Then, need help? Ezra looked at that for a moment. 14 months ago, sitting in the same classroom with Damien standing in the doorway looking at 12 students who were doing vocabulary work and hadn't looked up, they had talked for a long time. Not about the trial. Not about the arrest. About what comes after. About what it means to walk forward when you can't walk back. They had reached no dramatic conclusions. There was no declaration. No promise that covered the whole shape of what had happened between them and what it was now and what it might still be. They had just decided quietly to be people who were in contact. Who answered calls. Who sent messages when something came up that the other needed to know about. That was all. For now. That was enough. Ezra typed back. Yes. Come Thursday. He set the phone down. Turned back to the curriculum draft. Outside, the afternoon was moving toward evening, and somewhere in the building a door closed gently and a light in the front hallway clicked on. He kept working. There was a system out there that never stopped finding new gaps. New names. New languages to hide inside. He had spent his whole life learning those languages, not to use them the way they were being used, but to hear them. To know what they actually meant in the mouth of the person saying them. That wasn't finished work. It would not be finished in his lifetime. He picked up his pen, made a note in the margin of the draft, turned the page. 2 people had walked through a room full of money and lies and come out the other side of something that should have buried them. They hadn't come out unbroken. They hadn't come out clean. They had come out changed, which is the only honest ending available to people who actually go through things rather than around them. Not every story ends in a throne. Some end in truth. And some of them, the ones worth continuing, end with a classroom light still on, a curriculum that needs revising, and a Thursday meeting already scheduled. That's where Ezra Okafor was. Working. And if you've stayed with this story all the way to this moment, thank you. Genuinely. You just went through something with these characters, and that matters. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you think about the power of what we know and how we use it, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell us which moment hit hardest. And if you want to be here when the next story drops, subscribe right now and turn on notifications. We are telling stories on this channel that don't get told anywhere else. Stories about courage in quiet rooms. About what gets built when the system fails and one person refuses to walk away. You don't want to miss what's coming. We'll see you there.